The drums are the most important instrument in a modern worship band when it comes to how the song feels. But what if you don't know how to play the drums or how to communicate to your drummer to be able to play the things that you hear in your head? In this video, I'm going to teach you a few things about the drums so that you can work with your drummers to make your worship band sound amazing for Sunday morning. Hi, I'm Dave Dolphin at practicalworshipblog.com, sharing ideas, tips, and practical advice for the worship leader that has to do it all. If you're trying to figure out how to do all the little extra things when it comes to leading a worship ministry, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell right next to it, and we'll be here to help every single week.
This is how I'm going to approach this. Let's say you were going to go on vacation to Mexico. I'm not going to teach you Spanish. I'm going to teach you a couple of phrases that will allow you to get around in Mexico while you're on vacation. So I don't want to get too much in the weeds on any one thing, but hopefully this will allow you to understand what your drummer is doing and then to be able to communicate what you need from him to get what's in your head out onto the stage. Okay, the first two drums to talk about that are probably the most important are going to be the kick drum and the snare drum. The kick drum, also known as the bass drum, it's the big one usually in the front. The reason why they call it a kick drum a lot of times is that if you're in a recording studio and you tell the engineer, hey, I need more bass, are you talking about the bass guitar or are you talking about the bass drum? So somewhere along the way they say, well, let's just call this the kick drum, and now you have kick and bass. So, because you use your foot. So kick drum and snare drum. Snare drum's usually right here between the drummer's legs, and it sounds different than any of the other drums. These ones kind of have a tone. This one's snappy, and it's because it's got these little metal things underneath called snares that give it that kind of clacky sound. These two drums work together. It's what establishes the groove for the song. Usually a groove is going to be the kick drum and the snare drum working together. It can be real simple. Can be really complex. Now, almost always with the songs that we do in church, assuming a 4/4 song, which again is most of the songs that we do, the snare is going to be played on 2 and 4, the kick drum's on 1 and 3, but the snare hardly ever deviates from 2 or 4. We call this the backbeat. And so the kick drum pattern might get crazy, but the snare drum usually stays the same. You can go, I can add to it. And the snare drum hardly ever changes from that 2/4. And so here's the first tip. If you want to change how the song feels, focus on the kick drum pattern. As you're listening to the song and preparing for rehearsal and like trying to figure out what is everyone doing so you can lead the band, listen to what the kick drum is doing in the reference in the MP3 and then see what your drummer is doing and focus on that. So much of that groove, how that song feels, is going to be from the kick drum, not the snare drum. Here's an example. Real simple beat. I'm going to add one note, and it's going to sound like a rock groove. I'm going to move that one note and make a ballad beat. If I want to add a little bit of kind of like a hip-hop flavor, where now you're starting to kind of emphasize the ands of those 16th notes. Again, all the groove is happening with the bass drum, with the kick drum. Now, if you're right-handed, the kick drum is almost always going to be your right foot, and then your snare drum is almost always going to be your left hand. Your right hand, if the kick drum and the snare drum are establishing the groove of the song, your right hand is keeping time. You're going to do something where it's just like eighth notes, like this. I can change it to quarters. I can go 16th notes. But this right hand is always keeping time. And you can change the dynamics of a song as far as like how it builds and grows by where the drummer is writing on, where their right hand is at. Obviously, if you play louder or softer, that's going to create dynamics, but a lot of times you can change where the drummer is writing with these other cymbals, keep the volume the same, but it's still going to grow in intensity. So a starting point is this set of cymbals here. This is called the hi-hat, and it's these two cymbals that are kind of clocked together, and I have a foot controller that keeps them closed or open. And so if I keep them closed like this, I get this clicky sound. But I can use my foot pedal and open them up a little bit. And see how that kind of grew the song a little bit. And then, if I want to go a little bit more, I have a cymbal over here called the ride cymbal. If I want to go from like a verse to a chorus, and the song grows a little bit more. Now, if you are at the last bridge of Graves into Gardens, you have kind of one more step to go, which is the crash ride. These are called crash cymbals, and usually drummers will have them in various spots around the kit. And so there's not really a definite placement to put them. And there really isn't anything necessarily called a crash ride. There is a crash cymbal that is supposed to be like an accent for a section. If I am switching from a verse to a chorus and I want to define that moment, I'll hit the crash cymbal, and you generally only hit them once for that moment. But you can ride on a crash cymbal. So there's not really a crash ride cymbal. There is a crash that you ride on, and it sounds like this. So if you want to grow in your dynamics, if you want the song to grow without not necessarily increasing in volume, but just how you're utilizing the different cymbals, if you want the section to sound bigger or smaller, you might figure out where the drummer is currently playing and change that. So going from small to big, a song might progress like this. Now, the last two drums that we haven't talked about yet are the tom drums. And these drums kind of make a pitch, although they don't necessarily make a pitch like a guitar makes a pitch. Like, I don't necessarily have these tuned to like G and D, although if you're in the recording studio, sometimes you do that. But generally, you don't necessarily notice the specific pitch as much as you know that from here down, as you go from your left to your right, they go from higher pitches to lower pitches. Some people just have two, like this set. Sometimes you might have three, where it's 1, 2, 3. You can go bigger than that. If you have a drummer that grew up listening to Neil Peart and Phil Collins and all that, they might have 4, 5, or 6 of these drums. But all of these drums are used to create fills, which are kind of what you use to connect sections together. When you go from a verse to a chorus, or change from one section to another, you use that to kind of break up the monotony of the groove, just to change it up a little bit. An example would be like this. It just helps me get from a verse to a chorus, from a chorus to a bridge, and change those sections up a little bit. Fills are usually followed by a crash cymbal just to kind of define that section. Now, something that has become really popular in worship music in the last 5-10 years or so is the tom groove. Instead of using your tom drums for fills, you actually establish the groove with your tom drums. So instead of the groove being the kick and the snare, the toms actually kind of create that groove, and it sounds like this. And so instead of writing with my right hand and establishing time that way, my kick drum foot is actually going to establish the time. So I'm playing quarter notes, and then I'm just kind of playing grooves with my hands. Now, if you have a drummer that grew up listening to music from the 70s and 80s and even into the grunge of the 90s, this might kind of be a foreign concept. And so you might have a song that has one of these tom grooves in it, but they're trying to play this kick and snare pattern with it because that's what they're accustomed to doing. And you don't know why the song doesn't feel right. You just know it doesn't feel right. It could be that that section is a tom groove and it needs to be that instead of this kick and snare. So something to listen for and to be able to work with your drummers and say, hey, instead of playing kick and snare, could you do a tom groove? Tom grooves can stay on the toms. You can also introduce the snare on 4 to kind of give it a backbeat. You can do it on 2 and 4. And I'm not really playing anything specific. If anything, I'm just kind of playing a groove with my hands. Like if I was sitting in a high school math class and I'm banging on the edge of my desk and just kind of making up a groove with my hands, that's pretty much all I'm doing. I'm playing a groove that just kind of makes sense to the feel of the song, how the singers are singing, how the acoustic player might be strumming, whatever that feel happens to be. And then just establishing time with my kick drum by playing quarters or maybe sometimes eighth notes. Now, some final thoughts about working with your drummers. Most beginner and intermediate drummers, if there's a common thing, a common trap that they always fall into is that they overplay, meaning that they play more notes than are necessary for the song. And so they might be playing when the song really just needs this. So if you feel like you're getting too much from the drums, if it's just the drums are kind of overwhelming, maybe it's not a matter of them playing too loud. Maybe it's an issue of they're just playing a lot more notes. And so if they can simplify specifically their kick drum patterns and their fills. Sometimes a drummer will play a fill that is like a measure long or a half measure, and it can be shorter than that. So maybe instead of playing maybe the song just needs. So if you want to decrease just how much the drums are kind of sticking out, have your drummers play less notes, specifically with your kick drum and also with your fills.
If you're a drummer or really anyone in the band and you struggle with overplaying and you need a good analogy that helps you wrap your head around how you fit in the band, I have a video on what I call the pie analogy. It's right over here. That video down there is pretty good as well. Either one you pick, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.